If you like love stories with unexpected twists, subscribe and join me each week. That night, as the rain pounded against the windows of her small cafe, Sarah heard the words that would change her world forever. Miss Mitchell, I regret to inform you that the bank will be proceeding with foreclosure. You have 30 days to pay off the debt or lose everything. Hello. Before continuing with this story, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love imagining what country or city you're joining me from today. Now, let's get back to this story that's about to open many wounds and perhaps many hearts as well. Sarah Mitchell had put her entire soul into Moonlight Cafe. At 28, she'd invested every last cent of her grandmother's inheritance in this small space in the heart of the financial district. The cream-colored walls were decorated with black and white photographs of the old city, and the aroma of freshly ground coffee mingled with the soft sound of jazz always playing in the background. It was her refuge, her dream come true, and now she was about to lose it all. The crisis had begun 6 months earlier, when the corporate building across the street had moved, taking 80% of its regular clientele with it. The few remaining clients were no longer enough to cover the rent, bank loans, and basic expenses. Sarah had exhausted all her savings and worked alone 18 hours a day trying to save her dream, but the math was relentless. That March night, as she cleaned the cups for the last time, Sarah couldn't hold back her tears. On the table in the corner was the letter she'd received that morning from the bank. 30 days. 30 days to get $200,000 or watch everything she'd worked for disappear forever? That March night, as she cleaned the cups for the last time, Sarah couldn't hold back her tears. On the table in the corner was the letter she'd received that morning from the bank. 30 days. 30 days to get $200,000 or watch everything she'd worked for disappear forever. It was then that he heard the doorbell ring. He'd locked up an hour ago, but in his desperation, he'd forgotten to turn the sign around. "Excuse me, we're closed," she said without looking up from the cups she was washing. "I know," a deep male voice replied. "I saw his lights were on and thought maybe he needed help." Sarah looked up and met the most intense eyes she'd ever seen. The man was tall, wearing an impeccable suit, but his tie was loosened, as if he'd had a long day. His dark hair was slightly tousled from the rain, and there was something about his gaze that made her feel as if he could see right through her defenses. "I don't need help," Sarah lied, quickly wiping her tears with her apron. "I'm just finishing cleaning." Michael Harrison surveyed the small cafe with the gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating businesses. But he also noticed the details that only someone sensitive could see: the carefully framed photographs, the way each table was arranged to create intimacy, the upright piano in the corner that was clearly used for more than just decoration. "It's a beautiful place," he said sincerely. "It has soul, that's rare to find." Sarah was surprised by the comment. Most people only saw a small, simple cafe. "Thank you," he replied softly. "I built it with the idea of creating a space where people would feel at home." Michael approached the piano and ran his fingers over the keys without pressing them. "Does it play?" "A little," Sarah replied. "My grandmother taught me. It was her piano." There was something about the way Sarah spoke about his grandmother that touched something deep in Michael. His own grandmother had been the only person in his family who had truly understood who he was, beyond the Harrison name and the expectations that came with it. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said with genuine sincerity. "Thank you. She meant everything to me." This cafe was her dream as much as it was mine. Michael then noticed the bank's letter on the table, partially hidden under a damp cloth. The numbers were clearly visible, as was the official letterhead. His experience in the corporate world allowed him to immediately understand the situation. "Financial problems?" he asked softly. Sarah tensed immediately. "It's none of your business," she replied with a defensive coolness. "You're right," Michael apologized. "I just thought maybe I could help in some way." Sarah looked at him suspiciously. Why would he want to help a stranger? Michael was silent for a moment. "Because 10 years ago, when my grandmother was dying of cancer, I used to sneak out of corporate meetings to sit in a small cafe like this. The owner, an elderly woman named Rose, always let me stay for hours with a single cup of coffee, no questions asked. When she died, her family had to sell the place because they couldn't maintain it. It became an insurance office. Sometimes I think that if I'd known how to help back then, maybe Rose would have been able to keep what she loved." The story struck a chord with Sarah she hadn't expected. There was a vulnerability in this stranger's voice that contradicted his successful executive exterior. "What do you do?" he asked her. Michael hesitated. In the corporate world, his last name automatically opened doors, but it also created walls. Harrison Industries was one of the largest corporations in the city, and Michael was its youngest CEO ever. But here, in this small cafe with a woman who was clearly fighting to save her dream, he wanted to be just a man who understood what it meant to lose something important. "I work in business," he answered vaguely. "Corporate consulting." Sarah nodded without elaborating. There was something about him that calmed her, but also unnerved her. He was too refined, too self-assured, to be just a common consultant. "Well, thanks for the offer, but this is something I have to figure out on my own," she said, returning to her cups. Michael understood the farewell signal, but something made him stay a moment longer. "Can I ask you something? Why coffee? Why here?" Sarah stopped. It was a question no one had asked her in a long time. "My grandmother owned a cafe in Boston when I was a child. It started slowly. After school, I'd go there to do my homework. I watched how she connected with each customer, how she remembered their orders, their stories, their struggles. She said a cafe doesn't just sell drinks, it sells moments, companionship, a place where people can feel seen." His voice cracked slightly. "When she died, she left me enough money to start my own place. I thought I could honor her memory by creating those moments for other people." Michael felt something shift in his chest. In his world of mergers, acquisitions, and spreadsheets, he'd long ago forgotten that businesses could have a soul. "Your grandmother was right," he said softly, "and you are honoring her perfectly." Sarah's eyes filled with tears again. "Not for much longer," she whispered. Michael took a step closer. "How much does he need?" The question was so direct that Sarah looked at him in surprise. "Excuse me, to save the coffee? How much does it need?" Sarah laughed bitterly. $200,000. It might not seem like much to some people, but to me, it could be $1 million. Michael didn't blink. $200,000 was what he spent on a business dinner for 5%. It was the equivalent of a day's profit for one of his smaller subsidiaries. It was nothing and everything at the same time. "What if I could get that money?" he asked carefully. Sarah laughed again, but this time there was hysteria in the sound. "Where? From? Whose? I don't have a wealthy family. I don't have important connections. I'm just a woman who put all her eggs in one basket, and the basket broke." But Michael was already making a decision that would change both of their lives forever. "What if I told you I know someone who might be interested in investing in your business?" Sarah looked at him with renewed distrust. "What kind of investment? Because I'm not going to turn my cafe into a soulless corporate chain." "No, nothing like that," Michael replied quickly. "A silent investor? Someone who understands the value of preserving places like this, and what would that person gain in return?" Michael quickly improvised. "The satisfaction of knowing he's preserving something beautiful, and maybe ... a free cup of coffee now and then." Sarah studied him carefully. There was something about this conversation that didn't quite add up, but desperation was making her consider possibilities she would normally have rejected. "Why would he do this for me? He doesn't know me." Michael looked her straight in the eyes. "Because I believe some things in this world are worth saving. And because I have a feeling you'd do the same for a stranger if you could." It was true, and they both knew it. "I don't know," Sarah said slowly. "It sounds too good to be true." "Most good things sound that way at first," Michael replied. "Can I ask you something? If you didn't have to worry about money, if the coffee was safe, what would you do differently?" The question took Sarah by surprise. She'd been so focused on surviving that she'd stopped dreaming. "Live music nights," he said slowly. "Jazz on Fridays, piano on Saturdays, local art exhibits on the walls, maybe baking classes on Sunday mornings." He wanted it to be more than a cafe. He wanted it to be a cultural center. Michael's eyes lit up. "That sounds extraordinary." "Yes, well," Sarah replied sadly, "big dreams require big resources." "Not necessarily," Michael said. "Sometimes they just require the right connections." That night, after Michael left, leaving only a card with a phone number and a promise to call her the next day, Sarah stayed up until dawn. There was something about that encounter that felt like destiny, but there was also a voice in her head telling her to be cautious. The next day, Michael kept his promise and called her. They met at the cafe during lunchtime. when there were few customers. This time, Michael arrived with a folder full of documents. "My contact is very interested," he told her. "He's willing to cover all of her debts and provide additional capital for the improvements she mentioned." Sarah read the documents with growing disbelief. The terms were generous to the point of being suspicious. No interest for the first 2 years, minimum payments after that, and the strangest clause of all, the investor would remain completely anonymous. "This is too generous," he finally said. "What does this person really want?" Michael had spent the night awake preparing for this question. He just wants the cafe to continue being what it is, a place with soul. And maybe he'd like to be able to come in from time to time undisturbed. "Is he a celebrity?" Sarah asked. "Something like that," Michael replied. "Someone who values privacy?" Sarah studied the documents again. It was the solution to all her problems, but something felt too convenient. "I need time to think about it," he said finally. "Of course," Michael replied, "but the bank mentioned 30 days, right? Maybe I shouldn't wait too long." Over the next few days, Michael became a regular at the cafe. He arrived every morning at 7:30, ordered a black Americano, and sat at the corner table with his laptop. He didn't talk much, but his presence had become comforting to Sarah. What she didn't know was that Michael had canceled all his morning meetings so he could be there. As CEO of Harrison Industries, his day typically began at 6 in the morning with international calls and ended around midnight with business dinners. But those hours at Moonlight Cafe had become the only moment of peace in his day. One rainy morning, Sarah noticed that Michael seemed particularly tense. He'd received several calls that had made him frown, and he'd written emails with an urgency she hadn't seen before. "Everything okay?" he asked as he refilled her cup. "Work problems?" Michael responded briefly. Sometimes mediating between different visions can be exhausting. "What kind of consulting do you do exactly?" Sarah asked, sitting in the chair opposite him for the first time. Michael hesitated. It was the first time she'd shown personal interest in him. And he didn't want to lie more than necessary, but he also couldn't reveal his real identity yet. "Crisis management," he replied. "When family businesses experience internal conflicts, they sometimes need outside help to find solutions." It wasn't technically a lie. Harrison Industries had been founded by his great-grandfather, and Michael had spent the last 5 years dealing with conflicts between family members who wanted to take the company in different directions. "Sounds stressful," Sarah observed. "It is," Michael admitted, "especially when the people involved are family. It's hard to separate personal feelings from business decisions." Sarah noticed the real tension in his voice. "Does he have family in the business?" "My father and my older brother," Michael replied. "We have different visions for the future of the company." It was a massive understatement. His father, Robert Harrison, believed in aggressive expansion regardless of the human cost. His brother James agreed, as long as it meant more power for himself. Michael, as the youngest son who had unexpectedly inherited control of the company after his grandfather's death, was trying to find a balance between profitability and social responsibility. "What do you think?" Sarah asked. Michael looked at her, surprised by how icily he could talk to her about things he normally kept to himself. "I believe success shouldn't come at the cost of destroying what makes success worthwhile," he replied. "My grandfather used to say that a company that doesn't take care of its community is like a tree that cuts off its own roots." Sarah smiled. Her grandmother sounds like a wise person. Michael said wistfully. "I was the only person in my family who understood that there are more important things than numbers on a spreadsheet." For the first time since they met, Sarah saw Michael not as a successful businessman, but as someone who was also struggling with family expectations and difficult decisions. "Is that why your contact wants to help with the coffee?" he asked gently. "Because he understands what it means to lose something of real value?" Michael nodded, feeling guilty about the half-truth. "Exactly." That conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. Sarah began to see Michael not just as a client, but as someone who understood her struggles in a way few others could. And Michael found himself looking forward to those morning conversations with an anticipation he hadn't felt for anything in a long time. A week later, Sarah made the decision that would change everything. "I accept your contact's offer," he told Michael during his morning visit. Michael felt a mixture of relief and panic. The relief came from knowing he had saved something beautiful. The panic came from realizing he would now have to keep his identity a secret indefinitely. "Excellent," he replied, trying to keep his voice neutral. "He'll be very happy." The papers were signed through lawyers that same week. Sarah never learned the identity of the investor, only that the funds had been transferred exactly as promised. For the first time in months, she was able to sleep through the night without worrying about losing everything. With the cafe secured, Sarah began implementing the changes she'd dreamed of. She hired a part-time pianist for Saturday nights, hosted monthly exhibitions of local artists, and began offering small baking classes on Sundays. Moonlight Cafe transformed from a simple survival business into a true cultural hub for the neighborhood while maintaining its intimate and personal scale. Michael watched each change with a satisfaction that surprised him. He had never experienced the joy of seeing someone realize their dreams with his help. In his corporate world, financial decisions were abstract, numbers moving on spreadsheets, but here he could see the real impact of his investment on Sarah's smile, on the customer's happiness, on the life he had brought back to the small cafe. But keeping his secret was becoming increasingly difficult. Sarah had begun to confide in him in ways that made him feel guilty. She told him about her plans for the cafe, her hopes for the future, her gratitude toward the mysterious investor who had saved her dream. "Sometimes I wonder who he is," she said one morning. "He must be someone incredibly generous." Michael stirred his coffee nervously. "Maybe just someone who knows a good thing when he sees it. Or maybe someone who understands what it means to lose something important," Sarah added. "Like you and your grandmother's coffee." The irony wasn't lost on Michael. He was using his own story to justify his anonymity. But with each passing day, the lie felt heavier. Things got even more complicated when Sarah started inviting him to special events at the cafe. The first art exhibition, the first jazz night, the baking classes. Michael wanted to go to them all, but he knew it was risky. The more time he spent with Sarah, the harder it would be to keep his identity a secret. But he couldn't stay away. There was something about Sarah that drew him beyond mere physical attraction. It was her passion for creating something beautiful, her dedication to honoring her grandmother's memory, her ability to make every customer feel special. In a world where Michael was constantly surrounded by people who wanted him for his money or his power, Sarah valued him simply for being himself, or at least the version of himself she knew. The crisis came 3 months after the papers had been signed. Michael was at the cafe one morning when his personal assistant called him in a panic. "Mr. Harrison, I need you to come here immediately. Your father and brother have called an emergency meeting of the board of directors. They say they're going to vote to remove you as CEO." Michael felt like the world was tilting beneath his feet. He quickly apologized to Sarah and left the cafe, but not before she noticed the pallor of his face and the urgency in his voice during the call. That afternoon, Michael faced the worst betrayal of his life. His father and brother, with the support of some board members they had bought with promises of higher profits, had decided that Michael was too soft to run Harrison Industries. "Michael, you have talent, but you don't have the toughness necessary for this industry," his father told him coldly. "Your grandfather made a mistake by leaving you in charge. It's time for someone with real business acumen to take the reins." The vote was close, but sufficient. In a single day, Michael had lost control of the company he had run for 5 years, the company that had been his entire life. That night, she arrived at Moonlight Cafe just before closing time. Sarah immediately noticed something was terribly wrong. "What happened?" he asked, closing the door behind him and turning the sign around. Michael slumped at his usual desk, putting his head in his hands. "I lost my job," he said simply. Sarah sat down opposite him immediately. "I'm so sorry. What happened?" Michael looked up, and Sarah could see unshed tears in his eyes. "Family politics. Turns out being too considerate is bad for business." It was the first time Sarah had seen Michael vulnerable like this. There was something about his pain that moved her deeply. "What are you going to do now?" he asked softly. "I don't know," Michael replied honestly. "For the first time in my life, I don't have a plan." Sarah stood up and walked over to the piano. Without saying a word, she began to play a soft melody, the same one her grandmother used to play when Sarah was a child and had nightmares. Michael closed his eyes and let the music envelop him. It was the first time all day he felt like he could breathe. "Her grandmother was right," Sarah said when she finished playing. "Music helps. Yes, it helps." Michael replied like, "This place, like you." There was something about the way he said it that made Sarah look at him more carefully. All these months, she'd felt a connection with Michael that she couldn't fully explain. It was more than attraction, more than friendship. It was as if they understood each other on a level that transcended words. "Michael," she began, but he interrupted her. "Sarah, there's something I have to tell you." The tone of his voice alarmed her. "What?" Michael took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to say would change everything between them, for better or worse. "I am the investor," he said simply. Sarah blinked, not immediately understanding. "What investor? The one who saved your coffee?" "There's no mysterious contact. It was me. It's me." Sarah's world stopped. "No," she said slowly. "You're a business consultant." "No," Michael replied sadly. "I'm Michael Harrison. I was the CEO of Harrison Industries until this morning. The $200,000 came from my personal account." Sarah stood up abruptly, moving away from him as if she'd been physically struck. "Are you telling me you've been lying to me all these months?" "I didn't exactly lie," Michael began, but Sarah cut him off. "He didn't lie, really. He made me believe he was a completely different person. He made me believe there was a generous stranger who wanted to help me. He made me feel like a fool." Tears began to roll down Sarah's cheeks. It wasn't just the lie that hurt her, but the betrayal of the trust she'd built over months. "Sarah, please let me explain," Michael pleaded, standing up to approach her. "No," Sarah replied firmly. "Don't come near me. I can't believe you did this." "I did it because I wanted to help," Michael said desperately. "I saw he was in trouble and wanted to help." "Help or collect?" Sarah asked bitterly. "Am I like a charity project to you? The poor woman who needed to be rescued by the millionaire?" "It's not like that at all," Michael protested. "I care about you. I care about this place. It was never about charity. So why lie? Why not tell me the truth from the start?" Michael remained silent because he didn't have an answer that didn't sound selfish. The truth was, he had enjoyed being valued for himself, rather than for his family name and fortune. "You can't answer, can you?" Sarah said sadly. "Because the truth is, this has all been a game for you, a fantasy where you can pretend to be normal." "That's not true," Michael said, but his voice sounded weak even to him. "I want him gone," Sarah said with cold calm, "and I don't want him back." "Sarah, go away," Sarah repeated more loudly, "now." Michael headed for the door, but stopped before leaving. "Sarah, I'm sorry. I know I don't have the right to ask you to forgive me, but I need you to know that my feelings for you are real. Everything we've shared has been real." Sarah didn't respond, and Michael walked out into the rainy night, feeling as if he had lost something far more valuable than his job. The following days were the most difficult Sarah had experienced since her grandmother's death. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt her, but the realization that the feelings she had developed for Michael had been based on a lie. But what tormented her most was the fact that, despite everything, she missed him. She missed their morning conversations, his calm presence at the corner table, the way he truly listened when she spoke. A week after the confrontation, Sarah received a call from the lawyers who had handled the original investment. "Miss Mitchell, we're calling because Mr. Harrison has instructed us to transfer full ownership of the investment to your name. Effectively, you are now the sole owner of Moonlight Cafe, with no debts or obligations." Sarah was speechless. "I don't understand. Mr. Harrison has canceled all terms of the loan. The $200,000 are now a gift, not an investment. He owes nothing to anyone." That night, Sarah sat in her empty cafe, trying to process what Michael had done. With a gesture, he'd relinquished any control or influence over the place he'd saved. He'd given her everything without asking for anything in return. 2 weeks later, Sarah heard the news that Michael had been removed as CEO of Harrison Industries. The reports spoke of family conflicts and differences in business vision. She saw photos of him leaving corporate buildings, surrounded by reporters, with the same pained expression she had seen that last night in the cafe. Over the next few months, Sarah heard occasional rumors about Michael through clients who worked in the financial district. It had taken him a few months to process the loss of his company, but he had finally started his own consulting firm, helping small family businesses resolve conflicts. It was respectable work, but a far cry from the power and prestige he'd once enjoyed. One autumn afternoon, 6 months after their confrontation, Sarah was organizing a new art exhibition when she saw a familiar figure standing outside the cafe, peering through the glass. It was Michael, but he looked different. Thinner, dressed more casually, with a stubble of beard that gave him a less polished but more human appearance. Sarah watched as he watched her work, clearly debating whether or not to go in. Ultimately, Sarah made the decision for both of them. She walked to the door and opened it. "Hello," he said simply. "Hi," Michael replied. He looked nervous in a way she'd never seen before. "Just passing by. I saw the lights on. Do you want to come in?" Sarah asked. It wasn't a warm invitation, but it wasn't hostile either. Michael entered cautiously, as if it were his first time there. Everything looked the same, but there were new artworks on the walls, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee was still there. "It looks good," Michael said. "The place, it looks prosperous." "It is," Sarah replied. "The music nights have been very successful. We have a waiting list for the baking classes." "I'm glad," Michael said sincerely. He deserved this success. They stood in awkward silence for a moment. Sarah began. "The lawyers told me what he did. He paid off the loan, transferred everything to my name." "It was nothing," Michael replied quickly. "It was nothing," Sarah repeated. $200,000 is nothing. Michael shrugged. Considering what I'd risked by lying to him, it was the least I could do. "Why did he do it?" Sarah asked. "The truth?" Michael looked her straight in the eyes for the first time since she'd walked in. "Because I realized I'd confused saving your coffee with the opportunity to be near you. And that wasn't fair to either of us." Sarah felt something shift in her chest. It was the most honest answer she'd ever heard from him. "And now?" he asked softly. "What are you doing now?" Michael smiled sadly. "Learning to be Michael instead of Michael Harrison. It's harder than I thought." "I've heard about your new company," Sarah said, "that it's helping families like mine." Michael nodded. "It turns out that understanding the pain of losing something you love is a valuable skill in my field." There was something about the way he said it that reminded Sarah why she'd started having feelings for him in the first place. Beneath the wealth, beneath the lies, beneath it all, was a man who understood loss and wanted to use that understanding to help others. "Do you want a cup of coffee?" Sarah asked impulsively. Michael looked at her in surprise. "Are you sure?" "No," Sarah answered honestly, "but my grandmother used to say that the best decisions are made when you're not entirely sure about them." Michael smiled for the first time since he'd walked in. It was the first genuine smile Sarah had seen from him in months. "Black Americano," Sarah said, heading towards the coffee machine. "Remember," Michael observed. "Some things are hard to forget," Sarah replied. While preparing the coffee, Michael approached the piano. "May I?" he asked, pointing at the keys. Sarah nodded. Michael began to play softly, a melody Sarah didn't recognize, but that sounded like an apology set to music. "I didn't know what was playing," Sarah said, approaching with the steaming cup. "There are many things you don't know about me," Michael replied, still playing. "Most of them good, I hope." Sarah sat on the bench next to him, as she had so often done when he was just Michael, the business consultant. "Why didn't he tell me the truth from the start?" Michael stopped playing and turned to look at her. "Because my entire life, no one had ever valued me just for being me. It was always the last name, the money, what I could do for them. But you saw me as a person, not a bank account. And you thought if you told him the truth, that would change." Michael nodded. "Most of the time, it does change. People act differently when they know who I really am." Sarah considered this, maybe some people, but she didn't give me the chance to prove that I'm not most people. "You're right," Michael admitted, "and I'm sorry. I'm sorry I lied to you. Sorry I put my insecurities above your right to know the truth." It was the apology Sarah had been waiting for without realizing it. "I can't pretend he didn't hurt me," Sarah said. "He made me feel like an idiot. It was never my intention. You are the smartest, strongest, most authentic person I've ever met." There was such sincerity in his voice that Sarah felt the barriers she had built around her heart begin to weaken. "What really happened at Harrison Industries?" Sarah asked. The news reports were vague. Michael sighed deeply. "My father and brother thought I was too soft, too concerned about employees, the community, doing what was right rather than what was profitable. When I tried to implement social responsibility programs, they decided it was time for someone tougher to take over. And what do you think? I think they lost something important when they chose profit over people. But I also think maybe it's better this way. Now I can do the work I really want to do." "What is that job? Helping families like yours, small businesses being crushed by larger corporations, people who need someone who understands that it's not all about money?" Sarah studied his face carefully. The Michael before her was different from the man she had met months ago. There was less polish, but more substance. Less power, but more purpose. You know what the strangest thing is? Sarah said after a moment. That he lost all his power and position, but he looks happier than I've ever seen him. Michael considered this. Maybe because for the first time in my life, I'm doing work that truly means something to me. Not work I'm supposed to do because I have the right last name. Sarah felt a deep understanding. It was exactly how she'd felt when she'd opened the cafe. The difference between doing what others expected and doing what her heart desired. Michael, he said slowly, if we started over, from the beginning, without lies, without secrets, what would it be like? Michael looked at her with a mixture of hope and caution. Is she saying she wants to try? I'm saying, maybe we all deserve a second chance, to be honest, Sarah replied. Michael felt his heart race in a way he hadn't experienced in months. And how would we start over? Sarah extended her hand. Hi, I'm Sarah Mitchell. I own this cafe, and I love helping people find moments of peace in their busy days. Michael took her hand, feeling the warmth he'd missed so much. Hi Sarah, I'm Michael Harrison. I used to run a large company, but now I help small businesses survive. And I'm completely in love with the coffee you make and the woman who makes it. Sarah laughed for the first time in months, a genuine laugh that filled the space between them. That's a very direct introduction. Mr. Harrison, I've learned that life is too short to be blunt about the important things, Michael replied. And I am one of the important things. The most important one? Michael answered without hesitation. Sarah felt the last barriers around her heart dissolve completely. She leaned forward and kissed Michael softly, a kiss that tasted of forgiveness, new beginnings, and the promise of absolute honesty. When they separated, Michael rested his forehead against hers. I love you, he whispered. I love you for your strength, for your passion, for the way you honor your grandmother's memory every day. I love you for seeing the best in people, even when they don't deserve it. I love you too, Sarah replied. I love you for the way you truly listen when I talk, for how you value things that have a soul over things that have monetary value. I love you for being brave enough to change your life when you realized it wasn't the right one. The months that followed were like learning to fall in love for the second time, but the right way. Michael and Sarah took things slowly, building their relationship on complete honesty, rather than the fragile foundation of half-truths. Michael became a regular client again, but this time, Sarah knew exactly who he was. What surprised her was discovering that knowing his wealth and past didn't change her feelings toward him. If anything, it made her love him more, because he had chosen to leave power and prestige behind to do work that truly mattered. Michael's new consultancy quickly flourished. His experience in the corporate world, combined with his newfound understanding of the struggles of small businesses, made him an invaluable resource for struggling entrepreneurial families. But more importantly, he found fulfillment in his work in a way he had never experienced at Harrison Industries. One spring afternoon, a year after their reconciliation, Michael arrived at the cafe with a proposal that surprised Sarah. I've been thinking, he said, sitting down at his usual table. What would you think about expanding Moonlight Cafe? Sarah raised an eyebrow. I thought we agreed you wouldn't interfere with my business. Not to interfere, Michael quickly clarified. Just, to consult. Like I would with any other client. Sarah sat across from him, intrigued. What kind of expansion? Franchises, Michael replied, but not the corporate kind. Franchises that maintain the soul of this place? Independent cafes that share your philosophy of creating meaningful spaces? It was an idea Sarah had vaguely considered, but had never known how to implement without losing what made her coffee special. How would it work? Michael pulled out a folder he'd brought. Instead of selling franchises for money, you'd give them to people who truly understand the vision. Artists, musicians, people who've lost corporate jobs and want to do something meaningful. You'd provide them with the model, the training, and ongoing support, and the financing. That's where my part would come in, Michael said. I could provide the initial loans at rock-bottom rates, not to make money, but to create a network of places like this. Sarah studied the documents with growing excitement. It was a way to expand her dream without compromising her integrity. It would be like honoring your grandmother's memory on a grand scale, Michael added. Creating spaces where people can feel seen and valued, not just in one city, but in many. The idea was lovely, but Sarah had a concern. What if people think I'm taking advantage of my relationship with you to get funding? Michael smiled. So, we'll be completely transparent from the start. We'll do everything officially through my consulting firm. You'll be the lead coffee and culture consultant, and I'll be the financial consultant. Equal partners in everything. Equal partners in everything, Michael repeated. In business and in life, there was something about the way he said it that made Sarah realize this conversation was about more than just expanding the cafe. Michael rose from his chair and knelt beside the table, taking a small velvet box from his pocket. Sarah Mitchell, will you marry me? Not because you need rescuing, but because I want to spend the rest of my life building dreams with you. The ring was simple but beautiful, with a stone that captured the light in the same way Sarah's eyes did when she spoke of her passions. Are you sure? Sarah asked, tears in her eyes. Because once you say yes to a life with me, there's no going back to your world of luxury and ease. Michael laughed. Sarah, my world of luxury was a gilded prison. My real world began the day I walked through that door and met you. Yes, Sarah whispered. Yes, I want to marry you. They were married 6 months later at Moonlight Cafe, surrounded by all the regular customers who had become extended family. The ceremony was officiated by the local church's pastor, an older man who had been a customer since the cafe's early days. Instead of exchanging traditional vows, Sarah and Michael read letters they had written to each other, promising honesty, mutual support in their dreams, and a commitment to use their success to help others. The reception extended into the evening, with live music from the cafe's regular pianist and food prepared by Sarah, with the help of some customers who had volunteered. In their first year of marriage, they launched the Moonlight Cafe franchise network. The first opened in a small town 2 hours away, run by a former teacher who had lost her job due to budget cuts. The second was opened by a veteran struggling to reintegrate into civilian life. The third by a single mother who had been working 3 jobs to support her family. Each new cafe maintained the essence of the original, a place where people could feel seen, valued, and connected. But each also reflected the unique personality of its owner. 5 years after they married, Sarah and Michael had helped open 25 Moonlight Cafes in 3 states. Each maintained the intimate scale of the original, serving as a true cultural hub for its community, offering not only coffee but also occasional live music, small classes, local art exhibits, and a space where people could genuinely connect with one another. One autumn afternoon, while Sarah was organizing a photo exhibition of all the cafes in the network, she found a letter that had arrived that morning. It was from the owner of the first franchised cafe. Dear Sarah, I wrote, I wanted you to know that yesterday we saved the local bakery. They were on the verge of closing due to competition from a large chain, but our customers rallied around them. It's exactly the kind of community your grandmother would have wanted to create. Thank you for showing us that a cafe can be so much more than just a place to drink coffee. Sarah sat at her grandmother's piano, which now held a prominent place in the original cafe, and played the melody her grandmother used to play for her when she was a child. But now the melody had a new harmony, one that spoke of fulfilled dreams, found love, and fulfilled purpose. Michael walked in just as she finished playing. He'd been working late in his office, which was now located in the apartment above the cafe. What does the world sound like today? He asked, using the phrase he'd developed to ask her about her day. Like a symphony, Sarah replied, turning to smile at him. Complicated, but beautiful. Michael sat next to her on the piano bench. Do you know what I like most about our life? That every day, we do something that makes the world a little better than it was yesterday? Sarah leaned against him, feeling the solidity of his presence and the warmth of his love. It was true. Together they had created something that transcended their individual histories. They had built a legacy that honored the past while creating the future. On the wall behind the piano hung a framed photograph of Sarah's grandmother in her original Boston cafe. Next to it was a quote Sarah had found in her journals: "True love isn't about finding someone perfect, but about finding someone who makes you want to be the best version of yourself." Below that photo was a more recent one, Sarah and Michael on their wedding day, surrounded by all the people who had touched their lives through coffee. Their faces reflected not only happiness, but purpose. The satisfaction that comes from knowing your life is aligned with your deepest values. That night, as they closed the cafe together, as they did every night, Sarah reflected on the path that had led them there. The financial crisis that had nearly destroyed her had become the opportunity that had led her to the love of her life. The lie that had threatened to tear them apart had become the basis for a deeper honesty than she had ever experienced. And Michael, the man who had lost an empire but found his soul, now had something far more valuable than all the money in the world: a meaningful life, a partner who loved him for who he truly was, and the knowledge that every day he was using his talents to make a real difference in the world. As they walked hand in hand toward their apartment above the cafe, Sarah carried in her pocket the original key her grandmother had given her, along with her inheritance. It was no longer just the key to a dream, but the key to a legacy that would continue to grow for generations. And so, after everything she'd been through, she understood that true love doesn't always come when we look for it, but it always comes when we're ready to receive it with honesty, courage, and the willingness to build something beautiful together. If this story touched you deeply, tell me in the comments what country you're listening from. What part of this story moved you the most? Like, if you believe we all deserve a second chance at love, share this story with someone who needs reminding that there's always hope after loss. And subscribe for more stories that touch your soul. If you made it to the end, leave the word reborn in the comments. If you like love stories with unexpected twists, subscribe and join me every week. That night, as the rain pounded against the hospital windows, Sarah heard the words that would change her world forever. "Doctor, I regret to inform you that your husband will never wake up. The coma is irreversible." Hello, before continuing with this story, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love imagining what country or city you're joining me from today. Now, let's get back to this story that's about to open many wounds and perhaps many hearts as well. Sarah Mitchell had built her life around certainties. At 32, she was one of the most respected cardiovascular surgeons at the city's general hospital. Her precise hands had saved hundreds of lives, but that March night, as she stood motionless beside the bed where her husband, Michael, lay, she realized she couldn't even save herself. The accident had happened 3 months ago. A truck had run a red light, a brutal impact, and Michael had been trapped in a silence that the doctors assured would last forever. During those 12 weeks, Sarah had kept an almost religious vigil. She worked at the hospital during the day, saving other people's lives. And at night, she settled into that green plastic chair next to Michael's bed, telling him about her days, her surgeries, the plans they had made together that now seemed written in sand. But that night was different. Dr. Thompson, head of neurology and a longtime family friend, had been blunt. "There's no brain activity. Sarah, we've been waiting for 3 months for a sign, any sign, and there's nothing. It's time you considered turning off life support." The words had fallen on her like stones. Sarah knew he was right. As a doctor, she had given that same advice to dozens of families. But as a wife, as a woman who had loved Michael since college, the idea of pressing that button felt like murder. That morning, as she walked through the hospital's quiet hallways, Sarah bumped into Jake Williams. She'd seen him before in the pediatric oncology ward, always carrying a worn guitar and a smile that stood in stark contrast to the place where he worked. He was a music therapist, one of those jobs that Sarah, in her world of scalpels and precise diagnoses, had never fully understood. Dr. Mitchell Jake told her that night, noticing her puffy eyes, "I know we don't know each other well, but I've seen the way you walk these halls. You carry your pain like a backpack that's too heavy." Sarah stopped. There was something in the man's voice that disarmed her. It wasn't pity she heard, but recognition. As if he, too, knew that kind of pain. "Music helps," Jake continued. "It doesn't cure, but it helps. If you ever need a place to put that backpack for a while, I'm in room 3 of the pediatric ward every afternoon." Over the next few days, Sarah tried to stick to her routine. Surgeries in the morning, visits with Michael in the afternoon, sleepless nights reviewing charts, but something had changed. Jake's words echoed in her mind. Music helps. One April afternoon, after a particularly complicated surgery in which she had managed to save an 8-year-old boy with a congenital heart defect, Sarah found herself walking toward the pediatric ward. Her feet carried her, almost unconscious, to room 3. She found her with the door ajar. Inside, Jake was playing his guitar for a group of children undergoing chemotherapy. It wasn't happy music, but it wasn't sad either. It was something in between, something that seemed to embrace the pain without denying it, and, at the same time, offer hope without lying. A little girl of about 7 years old, wearing a colorful scarf covering her bald head, sang in a small but steady voice. Her parents sat in a corner, crying silently, but smiling at the same time. It was the most contradictory and beautiful sight Sarah had seen in a long time. When the session ended and the children returned to their rooms, Jake noticed Sarah standing in the doorway. "Doctor," she approached with a gentle smile. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I listened to music," Sarah replied simply. "It's been a long time since I've listened to music." Jake invited her to sit in one of the small chairs designed for children. Sarah felt absurdly large in that tiny piece of furniture, but for the first time in months, she also felt safe. "Do you play an instrument?" Jake asked. "Yes," Sarah replied. "Piano. When I was a child, I wanted to be a concert pianist. My parents told me that music wasn't a good way to live, that I should study something serious. Medicine was serious. Music was a luxury. And now what do you think?" Sarah was silent for a long moment. "Now I think maybe my parents were wrong. Maybe saving lives is important, but so is feeding the soul. And I think my soul hasn't eaten for months." Jake didn't say anything. He simply picked up his guitar and began to play a soft, almost imperceptible melody. It wasn't a familiar song, but something he seemed to be improvising on the spot, something that seemed specifically tailored to Sarah's mood. For the first time in 3 months, Sarah felt she could breathe deeply. As they returned to their rooms, Sebastian noticed Valeria standing in the doorway. "Doctor," she approached with a gentle smile. "I didn't expect to see you here. I listened to music." Valeria replied simply, "It's been a long time since I've listened to music." Sebastian invited her to sit on one of the small chairs designed for children. Valeria felt absurdly large in that tiny piece of furniture, but for the first time in months, she also felt safe. "Do you play an instrument?" Sebastian asked. "Yes," Valeria replied. "Piano. When I was a child, I wanted to be a concert pianist. My parents told me that music wasn't a living wage, that I should study something serious. Medicine was serious. Music was a luxury. And now, what do you think?" Valeria was silent for a long moment. "Now, I think maybe my parents were wrong. Maybe saving lives is important, but so is feeding the soul. And I think my soul hasn't eaten for months." Sebastian didn't say anything. He simply picked up his guitar and began to play a soft, almost imperceptible melody. It wasn't a familiar song, but something he seemed to be improvising on the spot, something that seemed specifically tailored to Valeria's mood. For the first time in 3 months, Valeria felt she could breathe deeply. From that afternoon on, she became a regular visitor to room 3. Children weren't always present. Sebastian often practiced alone or prepared repertoire for his sessions. Valeria would arrive after her surgeries, sit in a corner, and simply listen. They didn't talk much at first. The music filled the silences in a way that words couldn't. But gradually, they began to share stories. Sebastian told her that he came to music therapy after losing his younger sister to leukemia when he was 25. "I was playing in bars, dreaming of being the next big rock star," he told her one afternoon. "But when Maya got sick, I realized my music could do more than entertain drunks on Friday nights. In the hospital, when the treatments made her very ill, I played songs for her. It was the only thing that calmed her. When she died, I decided I wanted my music to continue to calm other kids like her." Valeria then understood why he had recognized her that first night. Sebastian, too, had carried a loss. He had also turned his pain into service to others. "And you, doctor, have you always wanted to save lives?" The question took her by surprise. No one had asked her about her motivations in a long time. Everyone assumed that being a doctor was a noble and obvious calling. "My younger brother was born with a heart condition," Valeria confessed. "We spent years in and out of hospitals. I was 10 years old when he had his first operation. I remember seeing the surgeon come out of the operating room, take off her gloves, and tell my parents everything had gone well. At that moment, I decided I wanted to be that person, the one who comes out of the operating room with good news. And your brother, it's okay. He's an engineer, lives in another city, and has 3 beautiful children. But I never stopped seeing that scared little boy on the table every time I operate on a child." It was the first time Valeria had verbalized that connection. David knew his brother's story, of course, but he had never fully understood how that experience had shaped his entire professional life. The weeks passed, and Valeria found herself waiting for those moments in room 3 with an anticipation that surprised her. After the most difficult surgeries, after the sleepless nights with David Darlow, after the impossible conversations with Dr. Ramirez about deadlines and irreversible decisions, that space with Sebastian had become her refuge. One afternoon in May, after a particularly emotional session with the children, Sebastian asked her if she wanted to join him for coffee. It was the first time they had met outside the hospital. They walked to a small cafe 2 blocks from the hospital. It was a simple place, with worn wooden tables and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee that enveloped the space like a hug. They sat by the window, watching people walk by on the street. "How is your husband?" Sebastian asked softly. It was the first time she'd directly mentioned David. Up until then, they'd talked about everything except why Valeria spent so much time in the hospital. "Same," Valeria replied. "There are no changes. The doctors say there won't be any." "And what do you say?" Valeria stirred her coffee slowly, watching the sugar dissolve in swirls. "As a doctor, I know they're right. As a wife, I don't know how to accept it." Sebastian nodded. "When Maya was sick, I too lived in that contradiction. I knew statistically what her chances were, but a part of me still hoped for a miracle. How did you find peace with that?" "I'm not sure I've fully found it," Sebastian responded honestly. "But I've learned that loving someone also means respecting their process, even when that process includes leaving." The words resonated with Valeria in an unexpected way. That night, when she went to visit David, she sat by his bed and, for the first time in months, truly observed him. His face had lost weight, his cheeks were sunken, the machines keeping him alive hummed with a constant, artificial rhythm. He didn't seem to be sleeping, he seemed absent. "David," she whispered, "I know you probably can't hear me, but I need to tell you something. I've been so scared of letting you go that I haven't asked myself if you want to stay." It was a conversation I should have had months ago. The following weeks were the most difficult of Valeria's life. Between surgeries, sessions in room 3, and nights spent with David, she began to face the decision she'd been putting off. Dr. Ramirez had given her a deadline. They needed the bed, they needed the resources, they needed an answer. Sebastian didn't give him direct advice, but his presence had become essential. One afternoon, while he was preparing his guitar for a session with the children, he said, "My sister left me a letter before she died. It said, she didn't want me to turn her death into an excuse not to live my life. It said that if I really loved her, I had to find a way to be happy again." "And did you find it?" Sebastian looked her straight in the eyes. "I think I'm starting to find her." There was something about that look that made Valeria's heart race in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just gratitude or friendship, it was something deeper, more complicated, more terrifying. That night, Valeria stayed at the hospital until very late. She sat next to David and talked as she hadn't since the accident. She told him about Sebastian, about music, about the confusion she felt. She apologized for starting to imagine a life without him. She thanked him for the 8 years of marriage they had shared. The next day, he spoke with Dr. Ramirez. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes, but the consequences would be permanent. Sebastian found her that afternoon in room 3, sitting alone among the small chairs, crying silently. "It's done," he said without looking up. Sebastian sat down next to her, picked up his guitar, and began to play. It wasn't a sad melody, but it wasn't a happy one either. It was a song about transitions, about endings that are also beginnings, about pain that coexists with hope. Valeria cried throughout the song. She cried for David, for the plans they'd never fulfill, for the guilt of still being alive while he faded away, but she also cried with relief, for finally having made a decision she'd been putting off out of fear. When Sebastian finished playing, Valeria looked up. "I don't know how I'm supposed to feel," he told her. "I don't think there's a right way to feel," Sebastian replied. "There are only honest ways." The following days passed in a blur of funeral arrangements, condolences, and the strange feeling of living someone else's life. Valeria's colleagues at the hospital were understanding, gave her time off, and assured her that her job would be waiting for her when she felt ready to return. But Valeria felt lost. For months, her routine had revolved around David. Without those nightly visits to the hospital, without that constant vigil, she didn't know how to fill her days. A week after the funeral, Sebastian called her. His voice sounded different on the phone, more formal, more cautious. "Dr. Mendoza, I hope you're well. I know this is a difficult time, but I wanted to invite you to something. I have a concert this Saturday at the Cultural Center. It's small and intimate, I thought you might like to come. Valeria hadn't left her apartment except for essential appointments since the funeral. The idea of being in public, of feigning normalcy, exhausted her before she even considered it. But something in Sebastian's voice, a vulnerability she hadn't heard before, made her accept. The cultural center was an old building with high ceilings and perfect acoustics. There were perhaps 50 people in the audience, sitting in folding chairs arranged in a semicircle around a small stage. Valeria arrived a few minutes before the show began and sat in the back. When Sebastian took the stage with his guitar, Valeria realized she'd never seen him in his full element. At the hospital, he was always in service mode, playing for others, adapting to the children's needs. But here, in this space, he was completely himself. "Good night," he said into the microphone. "Tonight, I want to share with you some songs about loss and renewal, about how sometimes we have to let go of what we love in order to love again." The first song was instrumental, a melody Valeria recognized from her afternoons in room 3. But hearing it here, amplified and with the full attention of an audience, was completely different. It was beautiful in a way that made her ache. The second song had lyrics. It was about his sister Maya, about his final days in the hospital, about the promise he had made to her to find happiness again. Valeria found herself crying silently, not only from the beauty of the music, but from the recognition of her own story in those words. The third song took her completely by surprise. Sebastian looked directly at where she was sitting and said, "This song is for someone who taught me that courage doesn't mean not being afraid. It means doing the right thing despite the fear." The song was about a doctor who saved lives by day and nursed a broken heart by night. It was about the strength it takes to let go. It was about finding music in the quietest places. It was about her. When the concert ended, Valeria remained in her seat as the crowd dispersed. Sebastian stepped off the stage and walked straight toward her. "What did you think?" he asked, but there was nervousness in his voice. "It was beautiful," Valeria replied. "Everything was beautiful. But that last song, was it really about me?" Sebastian sat in the empty chair next to her. "I've been writing music all my life, but I'd never written about anyone in particular. You inspired me in ways I didn't expect." There was something about the way he said it that made Valeria realize this was more than professional admiration or friendship born of shared trauma. "Sebastian," she began, but he gently interrupted her. "I know it's too soon," he said. "I know I'm probably the last person he should be thinking about romantically at this point in his life, but I also know that life is unpredictable and fragile, and that sometimes the most important connections come at the most unexpected moments." Valeria looked at him silently for a long moment. For months, she had been so focused on keeping David alive that she had forgotten what it meant to feel alive herself. The afternoons with Sebastian had been the only thing that had reminded her that she was still a whole person, not just a grieving wife. "I don't know if I'm ready," she told him honestly. "I'm not asking you to be ready," Sebastian replied. "I'm just asking you to consider the possibility that one day you might be. And when that day comes, if it ever comes, I'd like to be here." It was the most patient and understanding proposal Valeria had ever heard. The following months were a slow process of rediscovery. Valeria returned to work, but reduced her hours. She began taking real breaks, eating full meals, and sleeping 8 hours a night. Small acts of self-care she had abandoned during the crisis, Sebastian didn't push. They continued seeing each other at the hospital in Ward 3, but they also began seeing each other outside. Walks in the park on Sunday mornings, casual dinners after work, conversations that lasted hours about everything and nothing. Slowly, Valeria began to rediscover parts of herself she had buried years before. One afternoon, Sebastian took her to a music store and convinced her to play an upright piano they had on display. Her fingers remembered melodies she hadn't played since college. "He has the hands of a pianist," the salesman told him. "Are you looking for anything in particular?" Valeria looked at Sebastian, who smiled and nodded. "We were just reminiscing," Valeria replied. But that night, he couldn't stop thinking about how it felt to play again. The turning point came 6 months after the concert. Valeria had had a particularly difficult day in the operating room. A surgery that should have been routine had gone awry, and although she had ultimately managed to save the patient, it had been a brutal reminder of how fragile life is. Sebastian found her that afternoon in room 3, sitting on the floor with her back against the wall. "Bad day," he observed, sitting down next to her. Days like today remind me why I quit music, Valeria told him. My parents were right. Music doesn't save lives. Sebastian didn't respond immediately. Instead, he began to softly hum a melody Valeria had been playing on the piano the week before. Do you remember Maria? He finally asked. Maria was a 9-year-old girl who had been undergoing cancer treatment for the past few months. She was one of Sebastian's favorites during his music therapy session. Of course, Valeria replied. Yesterday she told me that when she's scared about treatments, she imagines you're in the operating room saving lives while I play music for her. She says it makes her feel safe, like she has 2 superheroes watching over her. Valeria felt her eyes fill with tears. Music doesn't save lives the way surgery does, Sebastian continued, but it saves something just as important. It saves hope. It saves dignity. It saves the part of the soul that makes life worth living. That night, Valeria made a decision she'd been considering for weeks. She called Sebastian and asked if he wanted to come over to her apartment. When he arrived, he found Valeria sitting in front of an upright piano she had bought that same afternoon. I want you to teach me how to play again, she said. Not to become a concert pianist, but to remember who I was before becoming just a doctor, just a wife, just a widow. Sebastian sat next to her on the piano bench. His hands guided hers through basic chords, simple melodies that gradually became more complex. But at some point, the music stopped, and what followed was inevitable. Their lips met in a kiss that tasted of loss and rebirth, of ending and beginning, of everything they had shared during those months of mutual healing. When they separated, Valeria breathed deeply for the first time in a long time. Are you sure? Sebastian asked softly. No, Valeria answered honestly, but I'm sure I want to try. The first year of their relationship was like learning a new language. Valeria had to unlearn the guilt of being alive, of being happy, of loving again. Sebastian had to learn to love someone who carried scars as deep as his own. There were difficult moments, days when Valeria woke up feeling like she was betraying David's memory, nights when Sebastian wondered if there was really room in Valeria's heart for a new and complete love. But there were also moments of unexpected beauty. Improvised concerts in Valeria's apartment, music therapy sessions where they worked together with the children in the hospital, surgeries where Sebastian waited in the waiting room, and Valeria knew she would have someone with whom to share both the successes and the failures. Slowly, they built a life that honored the past without being trapped in it. 2 years after they met, Sebastian proposed to her in the most appropriate way possible. During a music therapy session at the hospital, he had written a song that told the story of their relationship, from that first night in the hallway to the present. The last verse was a musically posed question about whether she would want to write the rest of the song with him. Valeria, surrounded by applauding children and nurses crying with emotion, said yes through tears of joy. They married a year later in a small ceremony in the hospital garden. Children from the oncology ward sang during the ceremony, and Maria, who had won her battle with cancer, was the ring bearer. In her speech at the reception, Valeria spoke about the different kinds of love she had experienced. The safe, comfortable love she had with David, the love born of shared pain she had found with Sebastian, and the love for herself she had had to learn in order to fully love another. I don't think we have to choose between honoring our past and building our future, she said. I think we can do both, if we have the courage to stay open to all the forms love can take. Sebastian responded by playing the song he had written for her that first night of the concert, but with a new verse that spoke of endings becoming beginnings, of scars transforming into wisdom, of love that does not replace previous love, but coexists with it in the expanded heart of a person who has learned to embrace life's complexity. Years later, Valeria and Sebastian opened a foundation that combined medical care and music therapy for families in crisis. The David Mendoza Memorial Center offered comprehensive support for people facing difficult medical decisions, family losses, and grieving. On the dedication plaque was a quote Valeria had found in David's personal journals after his death. True love doesn't end with death. It transforms, it expands, it becomes the capacity to love others more deeply. Valeria finally understood that David hadn't lost his place in her heart when she fell in love with Sebastian. Instead, the love she had had with David had created the emotional space necessary to love Sebastian in a more mature, more conscious, and deeper way. One afternoon, while watching Sebastian play for a group of children at the center, Valeria realized she had found something she hadn't known she was looking for. A way to transform pain into service, loss into purpose, love into action. In her pocket, she always carried two objects: the wedding ring David had given her, now on a chain near her heart, and the ring Sebastian had given her, shining on her finger like a promise of the future. The two rings didn't compete with each other. They coexisted, like the two love stories they represented. Like the two versions of herself that Valeria had managed to integrate. The woman she had loved deeply and lost, and the woman who had found the courage to love deeply again. And so, after everything she'd been through, she understood that true love doesn't always come when we look for it, but it always comes when we're ready to receive it in all its complexity, with all its contradictions, with all its capacity to heal and transform even the most broken hearts. If this story touched you deeply, tell me in the comments what country you're listening from. What part of this story moved you the most? Like, if you believe we all deserve a second chance at love, share this story with someone who needs reminding that there's always hope after loss. And subscribe for more stories that touch your soul. If you made it to the end, leave your voice in the comments.